The first question I have for you today, looking at where we are this week, it's been almost a week now since this attack, this terror attack at the hands of Hamas in Israel unfolded. What has been going through your heart and your mind over the past 7 days?
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking because we had a tour in Israel this past summer, and one of the people that we work with there, Israeli, his son-in-law was murdered in this attack. We have several friends that have lost loved ones, a number of friends that have been called up to military service, and as someone who's lost most of his family in the Holocaust, the barbarity and the atrocities of what Hamas did echoes back to that and opens up that trauma and concern for many Israelis and Jews around the world altogether, especially when you're calling for things like global days of jihad and to attack Jews around the world.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that trauma, right? I mean, everybody knows. It's so wild to me. Everybody knows what has happened repeatedly to the Jewish people throughout history. Most notably, before this, obviously, we had the Holocaust. Now we have this. This is not a normal event. This is not normal warfare. None of this is normal. And yet there are people out there who are protesting Israel. They're making claims, and we've heard, and I know you've seen this too, the really horrific things like gas the Jews that are being chanted in some of these rallies. I've seen some other speeches too. What do you make of that? What is motivating, in your view, that level of hatred?
Look, I think there has been an all-out assault by the extreme left and sometimes by the extreme right as well, that has infiltrated our universities with some of this radical, agenda that wants to blame the Jewish people as, persecutors, colonialists, apartheid, all of those sort of things that they're being accused of, which is the irony. It's absolutely the opposite. I mean, if you go to Israel, Arabs, Jews, Christians have complete freedom of religion, which is the opposite in, the Palestinian-controlled areas. If you go to Bethlehem, Christians are really being persecuted and discriminated against, in their own communities. So it's just, but I think the thing to really understand more than anything else, there is a political side to this. There is a geopolitical side to this. But the reality, the root of this is spiritual. And that's what we need to understand first and foremost, because you can't solve a political crisis. You can't solve a spiritual issue with political means, is what I'm trying to say. And so what's really interesting is that the word Hamas is actually in the Bible. And the first place it actually occurs is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11. It says, V'timale haaretz Hamas. And in the days of Noah, God saw that the world was filled with violence. Hamas, the word for violence in Hebrew is Hamas. And God was grieved, and he ultimately brought the flood on the world because of Hamas. And Jesus himself said, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man, Matthew 24. So I don't think it's any coincidence that in the days of Noah, there was Hamas violence in the earth, and that level of Hamas is literally being demonstrated today by the organization Hamas.
And, you can go down a very big conversation on prophecy and people being lovers of themselves. And a lot of the things that we're watching sort of happen, whether we're 1,000 years away or 2 minutes away or whatever, but we are watching these cultural shifts that are happening at the same time as what you just described, which I had not heard that before. So that's very interesting to me. But I also want to ask you something, about the roots of this, because it seems like people are very confused. They don't know the history. And so they're looking at this Arab-Israeli conflict, and they're seeing, as you were stating, Israel as the aggressor, and they're seeing the Palestinians as sort of the victims here. And what is the root of this? I know it's a complicated question, but what is the
Absolutely.
rooting of this current crisis?
Absolutely. And we have to understand the history. And so I just want to start out by saying that my heart breaks for the innocent Palestinians that are caught up in this terrible situation, and the suffering that they're going through is real. But then you have to ask the question, who's responsible? Is Israel responsible? And to really understand that question, we have to look at the history. So a quick rundown of history. Turkey controls all of what's Israel and much of the Arab world. World War I ends. They lose because they side with Germany. The UN takes control. They give the British mandate. Britain is in control after World War I. 1948, the UN comes up with the partition plan. They decide, split the land in two. Part goes to a Jewish state. Part goes to an Arab state. The Jews accepted the partition plan that the UN put forward in 1948. The Arabs in the land and the surrounding Arab nations, 6 of them, reject it, tell the Arabs, inhabitants of the land, to leave because they're going to wipe the Jews off the face of the map, and they'll come back and have even more land. Well, we know what happened. They didn't win. Israel formed a state. They ended up with more land. But still at that time, the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem was controlled by the Jordanians. Gaza and Sinai was controlled by the Egyptians. Okay? The Arab people did not call for their own independent state at that time, but the Arab nations, again, 1967, chose to attack again. This time, when they did, Jordan lost control of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Egyptians lost control of the Sinai and Gaza, and it created all of these refugees as a result of that. And instead of inviting these Arab Palestinian refugees into their nation, they put them in camps, displaced person camps, refugee camps, and basically did nothing to help them, and actually treated them like terribly in the Arab world. Palestinians by their own people have been treated really horribly as a political pawns. Time and time again, we can go through this. Yom Kippur War, same thing. Egypt attacked and lost. Then you go down to the Oslo Accords. Israel was wanting to make peace. The Palestinians got 95% of what they wanted, but rejected it over 5%. And so therefore, a Palestinian state was never established. And so the reality is that unfortunately, time and time again, the Arab world, the Palestinian leadership, has rejected peace and the establishment of the offer of a Palestinian state. And yet Israel somehow is to blame. It's really mind-baffling how there's become this revisionist history.
Well, it goes back to the spiritual issue, right, that you mentioned. And I think we know throughout Scripture, we're told there will be a blindness on those who are not believers. And I think when you look at this, it seems so clear. You just mapped it out. But the history seems very clear that the Israelis have repeatedly come to the table, have been willing to negotiate. And it's always the other side that says no. But I want to make one more point here, because I do think this is important. Even right now, as we're recording this, we do not yet have the official big land invasion going on. There's a little bit going on, but not the official big one. And yet Israel's gone out of their way to inform the Palestinians in multiple ways that they have a 24-hour period, right? They're letting them know, here's where you can go to be safe. You need to go there. And Hamas is not allowing them to go, or giving them incorrect information saying this isn't true, right? Using them almost as human shields, it feels like. That's the speculation in this. Again, not treating them well. And so when you were saying that, it made me think of what's currently happening again right now to those people.
Absolutely. That has been the history of Hamas. They establish their headquarters and where they store their munitions in schools, in mosques, in hospitals. This is very intentional, because if Israel does bomb those places, they actually get a media win, because they could say, oh, look, they bombed a school. So obviously it's a terrible situation, but you also think about it for a moment. Billions of dollars have been given into Gaza, okay? And what has the controlling power Hamas done with the billions of dollars? They haven't built schools. They haven't done much to enrich the lives of the people. They've used it to create terror tunnels, to create missiles, to fund terrorism. And many of their leaders who are calling for the day of jihad, they're living in lavish villas in other Arab nations. I mean, they've stolen the money from the Palestinian. Mahmoud Abbas, who is, the head of the Palestinian Authority, he's a billionaire. How did he become a billionaire? This is absolutely, it is terrible for the Palestinian people. They deserve better than this.
So one of the big questions, and you've heard this a lot over the last few days, anytime there's any kind of crisis in the Middle East, and particularly when it revolves around Israel, people start to look and say, is this part of eschatology? Is this part of the end times? Are we watching something unfold here? And so let's talk about that a little bit, because it is an interesting prospect. And I think it's only natural that Christians are going to look at scripture and then look at the events that are happening and ponder that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about in several of our books, one is our new one, Signs and Secrets of the Messiah, how the birth of Israel is a modern day miracle, and how somehow that miracle came about against all odds. So on the good news, God is a supernatural God, and in every generation there has risen up a Hitler or a Haman to destroy the Jewish people, yet God has preserve them because he's the God of the miraculous. At the same time, we have to understand that biblically there are patterns, and those patterns are meant to give us insight into what's happening in the world so we know how to respond. So what's very interesting is that the biblical holidays, and this attack happened on a biblical holiday. It happened at the end of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, on Simchat Torah, the beginning of the new reading cycle for the Jewish people of the book of Genesis. But it's interesting that the first holiday of the biblical calendar is Passover on the 14th day of Nisan. The last holiday is in the last month of the biblical calendar. It's Purim. It's the story of the book of Esther, where Haman tried to destroy the Jewish people. Passover represents God's redemption at the beginning of the history of Israel. Purim represents, in the book of Esther, what happens at the end. It happens in Persia. Persia is Iran. So it should be no surprise to us at this day and time, a modern day Haman, the first person in the Bible who wanted to commit genocide against the Jewish people, that a regime is rising up in Iran that is genocidal in its desire to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth, wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And we see this playing out now. So is this the end? I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying, it is a sneak preview to the direction the world is heading.
Yeah, and it may be setting the stage for some things that could happen later on. You also have this Russia factor, and that's also very interesting because and again, everybody has different theological views on where this goes, but Russia, some believe, is, Magog, and so you have Ezekiel prophecies there that I think are very interesting, and people are looking at the news. I mean, look, if you pull the news up right now, we're talking about Israel, Iran, Russia. It's kind of crazy, right? We're talking about these key players that have very much been at the core of a lot of, prophecy conversations now for a long time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to Genesis 6:11. God destroys the world, brings a flood because of Hamas. Another place the word Hamas is found is in Obadiah 1:10. It says, because of your violence to your brother Jacob, shame will cover you and you will be cut off. Well, Obadiah is prophesying against the Edomites. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. But what's interesting, who are the two most famous descendants of Esau? One is Amalek, the first person to attack Israel when they came, the Jewish people, when they came out of Egypt. And who is the other most notorious descendant? It's Amalek. We said Amalek. And who descends from Amalek? It's Haman. So Haman is a direct descendant of Amalek, connected to Persia. And why? And God says he'll forever be at war with Amalek. Why does God hate Amalek? Because Amalek, when he attacked Israel, he attacked the women, the children, the elderly, the defenseless, those who absolutely had no way to protect themselves. And this is exactly what Hamas did. It is the spirit of Amalek being manifest again in our day and our time. So there is something eschatologically significant about what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, and I love that we're talking about this, because I think that it's so easy, even as Christians, to fall into a camp of talking only about temporal things, only about the political fallout, only about what we can see and feel and touch and smell, and not the spiritual elements, which Ephesians 6 tells us that is what is going on. We are in a spiritual battle. That is what exists around us. And I feel like we don't really have a good sense of anything if we don't have any understanding that that is a reality for us. And so, especially with this issue, because it's so tied to God's people, his nature, and really the events we are told are going to happen at some point in the future. Just as we round out this conversation, what's your message right now to Christians? Because a lot of people are horrified watching this. They're not sure what to make of it. They're not sure what to do. They want to help in some way. And there's a lot of emotion. So what would you say?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are really important. I think number one is to understand that it is important for believers to pray for the peace of Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Scripture says, Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim, Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Don't believe the propaganda. I mean, Israel is a fulfillment of the promises of God in God's prophetic plan. The Israeli people, even though many of them are secular, they're horrified. They don't want to have to go to war. They want peace. And so don't believe this propaganda that they are, apartheid, that they hate Christians, that they hate Arabs. These are lies. It's not true. Anyone who's ever been to the land of Israel knows that that is not the case. So we need to stand for it. We need to pray. And I think the concern is that if we don't, it's like what Martin Niemöller said. They came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist. They came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew. And then when they came for me, there was no one left to speak up. Listen, this Hamas hates America. Israel's the little Satan. America's the big Satan. I mean, they would be happy to do to our nation what they did in southern Israel. So make no mistake, these people who are radical Islamists, I'm not saying the entirety of the Muslim world, I'm saying the radical Islamists would be happy to do the same for us. And we have to understand that and not be there, not promote it, not, say, oh, well, it's justified because they're persecuted. No. The other thing is, I think that's really important, is it says that God is really impressive on my heart. Leviticus 17, Tisa et achicha. Do not hate your brother in your heart. I think one of the most important things, if you're going to come against a spirit of hatred and bigotry, you have to come in the opposite spirit. We cannot come in a spirit of hate, or that it says in the New Testament, the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. There can be a righteous indignation, but it can't lead to hate, meaning I hate an entire people because of the actions of the few. It can't lead to hate like what we see in some of these demonstrations, like you mentioned that, where no matter what side we're on, even if you're for the Palestinians, when you start yelling things like gas the Jews or destroy Israel, you can't say you're a follower of Jesus and say those sorts of things. At the same time, you can't say you're a lover of Jesus and say, well, nuke the Palestinians. I mean, that's wrong too. So we have
Right.
to come, right? We can't let ourselves get to that level of hate. We have to come in the spirit of love. Love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't mean we don't respond Doesn't mean justice doesn't have to be done. But we can't go to the level of Hamas, which is they're killing people and they're celebrating it. They're rejoicing. That's evil. That's
It's
hate.
total evil. Yeah.
Right? We might
Total
have
evil.
to take defensive action, but it should break our hearts. It should break us that even when we have to do something and it's defensive in measure, we can never rejoice. It should sadden us because they're made in God. Everyone's made in God's image. To hurt one person is a terrible sin in God's sight.
Absolutely. Well, I so appreciate you taking us through this. Your book is Signs and Secrets of the Messiah, a fresh look at the miracles of Jesus. And you've got so much wisdom. People need to pick that book up, read it, and appreciate your time. As always, looking forward to having you back again very soon.
Hey, it's always great being with you. Thank you so much.